Thanks, folks. Noting that I am a substitute speaker at the last moment, thanks to COVID, because that's the world we live in. On the bright side, this is a talk I did a long time ago, or at least based largely on. Cool, so SRE at Goldman Sachs. So Goldman is a relatively new entrance into SRE. Like many of the companies that have adopted it, it's based on some sort of ex-Googlers wandering around the world, spreading the SRE knowledge, right? We're a little bit different in how we set SRE up. A lot of companies have adopted SREs and said, great, page monkeys, woo, right? But Goldman took the perhaps surprising step of not doing that. And so what we originally started was a sort of mission of bringing sort of culture change, of bringing the ability to think about reliability and build reliable systems to sort of engineering at Goldman, which had, quite reliable systems and so on, but ultimately lived in sort of the investment banking world, non-consumer banking of sort of 24/5-ish, 24/5.5. And, things got shut down over the weekend, rollouts could all be done safely, etc. And then Goldman found itself in a world where consumer banking was a thing, right? The Apple Card became a thing, and it turns out you can't turn credit cards off over the weekend. So that plus the customers stopped being on the other end of a phone line and started being on the other end of an API with their own monitoring going, hey, why is your stuff slow/unreliable? And awkward questions like that, that the whole just hope nothing goes wrong culture and sort of very reactive operations culture didn't necessarily do everything we wanted. And a lot of the teams at Goldman were already reading things like the SRE book. They're already starting to change. They're already adopting a bunch of DevOps stuff. It's not as if we came to a place that had none of that. But the SRE org was kind of landed there to provide a sort of synthesis and sort of coherent path through all the various things. So we kind of landed and started and sort of spun up a couple of sort of miniature clone Google-style SRE teams, which were of some success. They helped the people they touched, right? But they didn't have broader impact across the whole org. And we started to build a modern monitoring platform, which was kind of important to a lot of the stuff that we had to do. But we struggled with getting people to realize how what we were doing could actually help them. Yes, getting there. Getting there, right? And so what we've kind of pivoted a little bit to is more of a SRE practice org, an org that's trying to kind of uplift the way that, again, per our original mission, the way that the engineering at Goldman has access to tooling and techniques and training, and ideally feedback mechanisms that make them do things that you kind of recognize as SRE. And through that, the standard pyramid of, first monitoring and then start thinking about incident response, and one day we'll do capacity and so on, have all been sort of part of the SRE journey. But what I specifically want to talk about is SLOs, because it turns out they're really hard to come across as an org. And we basically said, you should hire SLOs, and people went, what are those? And that is where we were. So we came into a system where people were very reactive. They frequently had a very, very fast response to a system looking like it's come down, a customer report, all that sort of stuff, but not necessarily direct monitoring of what they want, right? And is my system working right? The standard thing, right? Well, no one's reported a problem with it, must be fine. Or there are no alerts firing. Nothing is over 70% CPU, it must be fine. Like no machines are down, it must be fine. But what there wasn't was that sort of direct monitoring of what does your system do? And the other problem we had is some systems at Goldman are big batchy systems that genuinely do not need 4 nines of reliability. And some are consumer-facing stuff where there's actually a certain amount of responsiveness. And having a language to talk about that became actually really important. And obviously, SLOs are the standard language you can use to kind of discuss that. So when we started out, everyone started out with, my system is very, very important and it should have a bajillion nines. And the sort of gentle reminder that Google gets 5 nines on its primary service by cheating is kind of an interesting realization for people to have, right? And so, well, how about 4 nines? It's like, well, about that like 4 minutes a month you have to respond to an outage. I hope there's no people in that loop because that's not going to work. So, oh, well, how about like 3 nines? I was like, yeah, it's still hard. Like none of your infrastructure supports really 3 nines, so 2? It's like 95%. Yeah, that's probably good, right? And that's fine for a batch system. And so we have a variety of different things, and a lot of this came down to sort of the platform choices and other things we did. So when we started out with this, we fundamentally started with a production system where people had built reactive alerts that modeled symptoms of the incidents they'd seen before. Because it's easy to measure CPU load, it's easy to measure memory load, it's easy to notice how many processes there are, and basically go, yes, this is the common properties of an alert, this is how we're going to do stuff. But the problem is, as everyone who knows that interacted with any of these, is that you get thousands of alerts per day, and most of them are transient and don't matter, and you have to build this very, very complicated, I would say nigh on impossible inference between those things that you observe because they are similar to an incident you've had in the past and users actually caring. And that was the loop we were trying to actually close. And it was surprisingly difficult. And again, we're not even close to SLOs here. This is entirely on the journey towards it, right? And so what we started to talk to people about is like, you need to step back from the details of what you're actually building. You need to think about how your users actually use it. You need to think about the business purpose of what the thing you're building is, which fortunately most people were totally across, and then start thinking in terms of how your users perceive your system, right? If your service does a thing, if your service generates a report, can you generate a report? No user cares what your CPU load is. They care, can you generate it, how fast it was, possibly whether it was correct. Up and down, like some people yes, some people no, right? And that became the basis of a journey. And we started out with the concept of, hey, you should measure your business function. And that came into like a whole bunch of workshops on basically how to do black box testing. And people were like, well, what's that? And I was like, you need to see if your system works. And they go, cool. So like if it reports an HTTP 200, it's fine, right? And it's like, yeah, what about the empty payload attached to that 200? Is that good? Is that okay? And they're like, right. And so we ended up having to sort of teach people about probes and synthetic traffic, because whilst certain services at, say, Google, as a random example, where all this came from, right, have enough traffic that they more or less have a flat line of user traffic the whole day, a little bit diurnal wobble, but basically people are using it all the time. You can infer whether the service is working because most of the people are using a JavaScript source thing that is doing the right thing. In much of the commercial world, in much of the outside world that's not doing like big user scale traffic is intermittent. And if you solely rely on user traffic, first of all, if it's intermittent, a single person doing something stupid can make everything look terrible. That's bad, right? And you're blind when they're not doing anything. And so we started to build the culture of like, no, think about synthetic traffic that you can use to do black box testing of stuff where you actually know is what's happening. And then we can actually kind of build an SLI around that. The idea of being either requests, which typically are based on user traffic, or just sort of time-based SLOs, right? Thinking about in terms of good minutes. Now, that's not perfect by any means. It's generally better to actually be able to talk about your outages in terms of how much user traffic was actually impacted during busy times. Obviously, the outage is worse than during quiet times, but it's a start. And it turns out to be radically easier to reason about sort of the bad minute type SLOs and compose them and like arrange them between different sources. So we kind of started there in a lot of what we actually built, and built the sort of user perspective part. And then we ran into other problems, such as people went, cool, let's have a Grafana dashboard. And so anyone started building these black box probers onto their own dashboard, and everybody had a different dashboard which looked different and was arranged differently, and they were almost unfindable, and people had a mixture of stuff inside their service that only they cared about, stuff that was user-facing that external users cared about but nobody could find, right? It was relatively hard to actually comprehend these, because everyone had done them slightly differently, and there wasn't any real sense of, well, what does this data mean? Where does it come from? right? And so this naturally, this led us to move on to where we kind of went next, which was, okay, we need you to think about SLOs, but that's like a really big conceptual leap. And we put together an initial, actually we should have had a picture of that.
Yeah.
The original version of this basically said, here's like an error budget with a graph of your error budget going down. And we spent months explaining to people what that meant. And eventually, we deleted the graph. Because it turns out, if you're in the process of trying to uplift an organization to, like, we've just gone through black box testing, and now we're starting to conceptually think about the description of SLOs and how to talk about whether your service is happy or bad. And you go, and here's a graph of error budget. And they go, okay, so my error budget is going down really fast and it's below the line. When should I alert? It's like, oh no, we've taken too many steps. And it's also the case that if you think about the classical SRE definition of error budget as evinced in the book with the chapter and with the thing and the guy and the horse and the dog, right? There are what? There are like 3 teams in all of Google that really use error budgets as part of a really tight control loop to control their feature release velocity to consume the error budget. 3 in all of Google, right? And everyone else just kind of goes, oh yeah, bit too much of the error-y stuff. Let's stop releasing things for a bit, or I don't know, reliability reset. Haha, Google people, right? Yeah, see, right? So, that kind of like bang control stuff is like, yeah, that's great, but we're not even there yet. Error budgets are like way down the line. So instead we went, okay, how do people think about stuff? They think about, my service is up, my service is down. I'd like to know if my service is up or down, and maybe if the next service over is up or down. And so we took the black box prober learning and actually have people measuring their business function, but what we constructed for them was a thing they could actually use without having to make big conceptual leaps. And we basically went, okay, people are used to they're very used to in some cases, the Amazon cloud status page, because lots of people spend a lot of time looking at it. Yeah, it's always lies, but hey, they do spend a lot of time looking at it in vain hope that it will tell them what's breaking them. But the Twitter status page, the Google status page, the Microsoft status page, and we went, okay, cool, that whole day-by-day status thing, that's useful. People understand that. Why don't we build a thing first, rather than SLOs, which were used to be on the front page of this thing? Why don't we instead just talk about statuses? And we're measuring the business function. This is actually a black box prober. It provides a really reliable signal of whether the system is happy or not. And we will provide a little box, as you see on the left-hand side of that, which is uniform for all the different services we have, so you can go to a single place and consume the status of all of the onboarded services right now. And hey, just as a little fillip towards the idea of long-term thing, why don't we show you how it's been this week? And that's what those little boxes are. And suddenly people can go, has my system been reliable? Has my system been unreliable? Have I been having problems for a while now that I've got this particular outage? And suddenly people could consume things. They could spend time doing the black box prober. They could onboard something that you could constructively call let's call it a first SLI, or a first couple of SLIs. And they could actually, from there, get something they could actually use, right? First day, SLI, wired to SLO repo, and suddenly you have something you can use. Now, no mention of an SLO. And so we're trying to get people to onboard and conceptually start thinking about what an SLO actually is without having an SLO in front of them. Just something they can immediately use from the SLI, right? Tell me when you want to grab this, right? And then the whole SLO piece comes into long periods. And so you start thinking about, rather than a week, you start thinking about 28 days, and 28 days turns out to be a thing that people got super obsessive over, but it turns out, incidentally, 0 people want 28 days as a measurement period. They actually want a month, because that's what all reporting is and all things are. But it's close enough, and you can kind of approximate it, and there's a little few, we ended up doing that. Also learnt that from network SLOs back in Google, right? And a well-defined SLO, or well-defined SLO, kind of gives you the service status for almost free, and people can actually read it. Now, one of the things we also did was the whole red-green thing wasn't necessarily, well, ignoring colorblind people. It turns out we've carefully chosen the chroma so colorblind people can see it. We happen to have a colorblind person as one of our managers, so he tests it for us. So we carefully did the chroma thing. But we also added the ability to think about, dead, alive, and wounded, and get people to start thinking about a little bit of nuances, right? This is slow but okay, slow but working. And we started to add that sort of additional pieces to actually build out the very early stage of you get something from onboarding to SLO repo, you get to kind of talk about things now. Is the next slide yours, or?
Oh, no.
Cool.
Traceability.
Yeah. The other thing we actually did is, remember that whole traceability thing? The SLO repo we built has all configured via IAC, regrettably YAML, but people make terrible choices and then we live with them for years afterwards, right? So IAC, all the people contribute their stuff, right? And so one of the things we did is, having been deeply unhappy about all of the fact that there's impenetrable dashboards all over the place, all of SLO repo was built with the idea that if you click on one of the little squares, it will show you what's under that. If you click on that, it will eventually click through to the underlying Grafana graph of the data. So you can actually go and see the data and interpret it. And similarly, if you click on the definition of things, it will take you all the way through to the actual YAML. So we've actually built this very concretely as, yes, we are this cool dashboard on top of things, but actually this is just your underlying config. This is just your underlying monitoring. You still own all of this. We're just providing a kind of useful view on top of it for you.
Yeah. Cool.
Your turn.
Yep. Thank you, Bruce, and good afternoon, everyone. So as we can see, resiliencies in people also for the talks. So thank you, Bruce, for stepping in for this talk. So Bruce have talked a lot about what we do in SRE in Goldman Sachs, and here's our response. SLO Repository is our response to those challenges that we see just now. So we answer the following questions. Is my service okay right now? Is there a problem earlier? How many service was impacted during an incident? And how reliable is my service over time? And do I meet my user expectation? SLO Repository is a platform for publishing and finding SLOs and services and status. So on the main page, we will see a high-level overview of what are the services that is on SLO Repository. So it gives our stakeholders and users an overall glance of how the organization is performing in terms of different services. On the first column, it will represent the current status of the services. And then also on the incident column, we will see is there any ongoing incident for that service. Phase, we will come back to it later. And then we will have a verbal explanation of the status, which is status detail. So it helps our user understanding what does different status mean. And we have a 1 week of daily status to help gauge how reliable or how is your service performing at a high level overview in one page. So this is not a replacement of your diagnostic or operational dashboard. So this is barely giving a stakeholders and user overall view on what is expected from your service. So what does status mean? So status is a near real-time representation of your service. We can think of it as the SLI, which is good event over valid event over a period of time. But we can think of it as a period of time that is really short. So it's give a much faster feedback loop to our user, so it's more responsive to different changes or different events within a short period of time. And unlike SLOs, you can either miss it or you can reach your target. Status takes different values. So we have different values. Operational, meaning your service is operating as expected. Your user is using what is intended. And degrade, meaning that you can still use your service as your business function, however, it's in a degrade state. We can think of it as higher latency, the response time is significantly longer. And disrupted, meaning you cannot perform the business function of the service. Unknown, meaning that SLO Repository cannot have visibility on your service, which means that it highlights some monitoring issue with your service. Downtime is an interesting one. Downtime meaning that there's a scheduled maintenance window or your service is not intended to be used at that time. So on the page, this is a status page for one service. On the top, we have a status summary. So it's give a high-level overview of your service, how they're performing over time in a fixed period of time. So a day, a week, and 28 days. And then followed by a 31-day of status history. Each box represents a date of status. So the color represents the majority status of that day. We have an internal threshold. to gauge whether a degrade or disruption is significant enough to mark that whole day as fully read, or like partially read, or like degrade. So this helps our user understand what is the impact during that day. Instead, like, for example, is it like, is 1 minute disruption really impacting our user? Is it related to like monitoring issue? So this helps our user understanding is the impact, how much is the impact of the disruption of that day. And if you select one of the boxes, you will see a detailed timeline of that day. How is your service performing over that day? And then different color represent different status throughout the day. So going back to downtime. Downtime is like interesting, unique to Goldman Sachs. A lot of the services is operating around market time. So for example, it's operating against the exchange. So outside market time, it may not, but it's not expected to be running. And also, if you see on the graph, on the weekends, the market is not open. So this helps to communicate the expectation to the user that you are not intended to use your service at that period of time. And also throughout the day, you will see status over the market hours. And then outside the market hours, we will highlight that at downtime. And apart from status to represent your service reliability, we have events to help our stakeholders to understand what is happening with the service. If you hover over a box of status history, we will see a summary of what is the duration of the disruption, is there ongoing incident of that day, so it helps our stakeholders understand it. So we have events on the timeline, incident that can be raised by user or on-callers to signify there's an incident, pages that is system-generated alerts, and annotation, which is like some interesting event that like our service owner can annotate to help explain what might be the cause and what might be contributing to the disruption and degradation. So all this is to help our user to understand what is the expectation of the service and what is the current state of the service. So typically, a service can be a bunch of services grouped together to perform a single function. So we have two different types of service that support that. Subservices, we can think of it as microservices that group together to perform a business function. So it can help us to localize impact to different aspects of the service. And supporting service, it can be services that contribute to your runtime, but it may not be owned by you. You may not have ability to change it. So we highlight that as supporting service, which may be a critical dependency of your runtime. It can be your container runtime platform, or it can be an object storage platform that you rely on your runtime. So we have status. So this is like abstraction away from SLI, but behind the scene is actually backed up by SLI, because SLI we get status from SLI almost for free. So we have SLI and SLOs on services. And it's typically aligned with status. And each service can have multiple SLI that covering different aspects of the service. So we can think of like how are they two related. So as I mentioned before, SLI, a status is a short windows of SLI. So we can think of this UI service as example. We have 3 different SLI or SLO defined for it. We have freshness of the content, we have response availability, we have response latency. So we can attribute response availability to disruption and operational because it's not available, and latency to degradation. So if it's like not meeting the short period of time, we can mark it as degrade. And then like if it's not available, then we can mark it as disrupted. So this is how they are related together. And we have a unified, standardized way of defining SLO and their definition. So most of the time when you say like 99.9 SLOs, what does it actually mean? So this is a way for us to tell our user, our stakeholders, what are we actually measuring, what is the target that we are showing, and what is the time period that we are observing to evaluate our SLOs. So SLOs have a longer period of time. So unlike status that is short period, it will allow you to evaluate your service in a longer period of time which may align with your development cycle. So you can gauge whether, if your release is like doing performance increase or like increases your reliability over time. So when we see that there is like some breaches of the SLOs, we have another visualization, which is the daily pro rata SLO performance over time. So we can see that two graphs. The two services have actually breached the SLOs over a longer period of time. But we can see that the characteristic of it is really, really different. So the top one, we can clearly see that there's a particular bad day over that month. And on the bottom, we have a bunch of near misses over time. So the top one may result in an incident that can have pages that will have like communication to your user. And the bottom graph can be hinting that there might be some slow burning issue of your capacity, or like it might be pushing over the edge of your service. So both of them have impact to your user, but they are different in nature. So instead of thinking traditionally like a Grafana graph, you may have a line graph, you will have like your threshold, and then you have dips around it. Most of the time, as our encoders, you will look for those dips. But this visualization to help us to understand, looking back, okay, is it actually a big one or is it a small one? Is it significant enough to be an incident? And most of the time, if we're thinking about the old days, we infer the reliability from incident. This can help us to catch those slow burning issue like way beforehand. So this is a powerful visualization that we have for our service owner to understand what is the reliability of the service over time. So apart from helping our service owner to understand what might be the breaches of the SLOs, we have a longer period of time evaluation. Because like looking at a graph for a really long period of time, we may not see like what is the trend of the SLO's performance. And we have a point in time, we may have point in time performance that may not be that helpful. So we have long-term reporting that is aligned to monthly. So this helps align our planning and reporting align with the business. Ultimately, our users tied to the business. And this helps them to have the conversation and having a long-term period of time of seeing the trend of like whether you should plan your development velocity and or should you invest in reliability on different aspects of your SLOs that is covering your service. So this helps align our reporting with the business. So it incorporates that reliability talk into the business planning. So putting all this together, we have a near real-time representation of the service with service status signals. So it helps our user understanding what is the expectation of the service right now. Is there ongoing incident? Was it reliable on a particular day? Especially useful for writing postmortem. And then we have SLOs, which is a standardized way to define SLO from different teams. And for example, an interesting use case for the SLO is that if you want to build something within an organization, you might have multiple different services that perform a similar function. But how do you evaluate whether, like, which one to choose? This can be one of the factors, like, for example, you want to build like 3 nines. Do you want to build something that with 1 9? Like, do you need to build something else to replace it? So this is an interesting platform for different teams to publish the SLO and also finding SLOs. And then finally, we have long-term report to align with our business to understand, to help drive the conversation whether you should have invest more in your feature development or reliability. So this is all like pretty graphs and then all the like visualization. But SLOPoetry is only as effective, as Bruce mentioned, as the metrics that is coming from. So how do we maintain that quality of metrics? Because like you can always show green, you can always show 100%, it's just a number, but where does the number coming from? So onboarding teams to SLOPoetry is a challenge because like we have to change the mindset of people from thinking in terms of system metrics, CPU, and then thinking in terms of user perspective. Because as a developer, you might be too deep into the different components, into the code, that sometimes you may forget like how the user is using your service. So using user traffic within an organization is doable, but most of the time, we can't tell whether it's the change in the user behavior or actual change in your code or your system. And let alone, there might not be enough traffic to justify your SLI and SLOs. For example, if the market is not open, you will have no traffic to some of the services in our organization. So we advocate to use synthetic client that mimic a user journey, so we can control what are the user journey that we are covering to support those SLI and SLOs. Meaning that we have to do test transaction in critical system, and which is a challenge. Some of the service, as like one of the talk mentioned before, like your probing traffic may be more than your actual user traffic, that might tip over your thing. So, which is like an interesting aspect to have like SRE to work with our development teams to develop how do we go about the probing, what we should be measuring, what is the service that is defined from a user perspective. Not all the teams within the firm have SRE team. And SRE at Goldman Sachs act as a consultant to work with different teams to do business analysis, defining what is the user service, what is the service hierarchy, what is the service boundary, and constructing SLI and SLO from it. The goal of this team is to drive the adoption of SRE practice across the whole organization. So think of it as a blueprint of how we drive SLO adoption into the firm. So in order for us to help gauge what is the maturity of your status signals and your observability, we have something called status phase or service phase. So it signifies what is your maturity in terms of your monitoring. It has different phases. We have dev, incubating, and live. Throughout this whole onboarding process, SRE team and development team will work together to onboard a service onto SLOPoetry. So what does the journey look like? We have 3 main stages. We have scoping, implement checks, and doing review. Scoping is where the SRE team, user, and the service owner sit together to define what is the user service and what is the service hierarchy and what should be the user journey for that service. And then we define SLO definition and work out what is the measurement strategy to support those SLI measurement. And then the team will be onboarded to SLOPoetry, marking as dev, which means that they are free to experiment with their signals, and then they can experiment with different monitoring strategy and different service hierarchy. After a period of time, when both SRE team and development teams are happy with the status signals, we will implement some checks on it. So we will incorporate incident data and also checking if the service hierarchy makes sense and make sure that there's actual ownership of that service. And then we will put the service into an incubating period of time, which we highlight as incubating. So this incubating period of time is to catch any surprises that we may not have foreseen over the development of this SLI and SLOs. And then after that observed period of time, we will have a review on seeing is there any overlap or correlation between the disruption and the incident that we have discovered on the signal. So you use this to find if the signal quality is actually representing the actual status of the service. And also, vice versa, we will look for any unexplained disruption. So if you're showing a disruption that do not have an incident, it might be the fact that your monitoring is too sensitive, or it can be something that is not, you don't expect it. And then also we will check for any correlation between SLOs and status. So after those check out, we will mark that service as live. So after live is not the end of the story. So after live is meaning that they have successfully onboarded to SLOPoetry. Some teams will go through their operational review meeting using SLO Repository to gauge what should they be working on next, and then should they invest more in working on reliability work, or are they meeting their promises to their user? So this creates an ecosystem for development team, stakeholders, and SRE to work together to define SLO and SLI, and then having a review to continuously improve the data on SLOPoetry, and also that SLOPoetry to feedback those data into the decision. This is not the end of our journey. We only scratched the surface of it. And SLOPoetry definitely have more potential, and we have more things planned for it in the future. As we have onboarded more SL and SLO onto the platform, we will discover common patterns. So 2 days ago, there was an interesting talk. Someone raised a question like, if you want to create SL and SLO, you have to do from metrics, configuration, all the way to dashboard, and then having a definition. So adding those metrics require manual work. Like, how can we make that less toily? So we have common patterns of SL and SLO. We can create templates to help teams to define the SL and SLO from ground up. Because all these are config-driven, we can generate config from it. And having that, and also having ongoing automated audit. So we have the onboarding process of SLOPoetry, on service onto SLOPoetry. We have a dedicated team of SRE working with it. But SRE is all about eliminating toil and automating things. So we have come up with, we're working on some signal quality metrics to help gauge the correlation between the disruption and the incident data. So to help the team to have a continuously check on whether your SLI and your status is reflective of user experience. And we have postmortem integration. So we can add in the status timeline of that day in the postmortem and help different stakeholders understand, oh, during that incident, what have happened, what is the scope of the impact of that incident with SLOPoetry data. So we can help write half of the postmortem with that. And also we can have service dependency discovery. Despite the fact that we have sub-services that highlight that might be a group of services that may work together to perform a business function, most of the time we will find surprises that during an incident, multiple services that is seemingly not related have gone down together. So we can use this to discover any service that is implicitly dependent on each other without explicitly defined in our configuration. So this helps drive the conversation on, oh, are we putting all the eggs on one basket? And apart from incident and also pages and annotation, we can have more change event incorporated into SLOPoetry. So for example, if you have done a release, after you do a release, maybe it turned to red, or maybe it turned to green from red. And then also there is some interesting market event that can also be highlighted that is specific to a certain application. And so one interesting fact about financial institute, some of the exchanges in the world may not operate differently during an extreme weather condition. So for example, in Hong Kong, during a typhoon season, on that day, they may close the exchange. So we can highlight those events onto the timeline to signify that, oh, this is not expected to be running. And also daylight saving is also a date that you want to highlight that might cause us some issue.
Oh, yeah.
So building an SLO repository and onboarding teams to SLOPoetry, we have learned 5 key lessons. So this is not exhaustive. So onboarding SLO is full of surprises. Even ourselves, SLOPoetry, onboarding to SLOPoetry is full of surprises. We may think that we know all about our service. We know in and out, we know the code, but until you actually measure it, you will find all the surprises. And also, from time to time, it can be related to the user expectation of your service may not be aligned with your design and intent. Different type of service require different flavor of SLO. This is a given. So despite the fact most of the services can be classified as request response based, behind the scene it can be different. As the backend API design talk just before, it can be synchronous or asynchronous. So it have a different characteristic in terms of performance and how you measure or exercise the user journey. Adopting SLOs requires significant effort from service team and SRE. defining the service hierarchy, knowing the service boundary, and also having a measurement strategy that support the SLI that we have promised require a lot of work, especially when you try to implement a synthetic client. It requires multiple iteration. So this drive down to the other point, measurement strategy is the key to the signal quality. As Bruce mentioned, measuring 200 with an empty payload will not be reflective of your user experience. And you want your synthetic client to be as close to your service, your user journey. And finally, SLO definition, maintaining SLO definition is an ongoing exercise. You keep on changing your software, you keep on changing your service, so is your SLOs. You can add in new features, you should add in more SLOs onto it. If you demise a feature, you want to remove it. So let's recap on what we have gone over. Why do we measure SLOs? Because we want to measure something that is represent our user experience to help our service owner to understand how is the user perceiving our service. We use tools, SLOPoetry, configuration-driven, to help navigate our firmware observability. So SLOPoetry is only the facade or service of our observability stack. Behind the scene, it will involve a lot of monitoring stack. So all these tools help us to bring that up. Our journey to use tools to drive adoption, having a tools help us to build our teams to help onboard teams to on SLOPoetry, using that blueprint to help drive those adoption. Final 2 points is making SLOs easy to understand for our stakeholders. Like short feedback loop, help them understand the impact of your SLI and SLOs. And having a platform making SLO discoverable will drive ongoing feedback loop. So if they can see it, they will question it, and that drive ongoing iteration of SLI and SLO involvement. And with that, thank you, everyone.